Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Glad to have you back again with us. We are going to have another Q&A, our last of 4 Q&A podcasts. You sent in some great questions. Please keep sending them in. And we are going to use this episode just to clear out the inbox and finish with the questions that came in during this first session. So, like I say, the last of 4. We are struck by, I find, Mike, as I've talked to people who listen to the podcast, as one person said to me today over lunch, I have a coworker who happens to be a avid listener to the podcast, and he expressed thanks for especially he said what he called the air of kindness between two people who don't always agree. And I hope that's good. I mean, I hope that's very evident that people like you and I should be doing it the way we do, where we enjoy talking about the Bible. If we disagree, we disagree, but it's not a big, it's never a problem. And he said that in context of other situations where he's been, where disagreeing on a theological point has been a problem, and it has caused division in a church or, with other Christian friends. And my hope in all this is that people learn, or we all learn together, that the Christian family is expected to, like a Peter and a Paul in Galatians 2, to not see everything the same, but coexist in a loving and happy and joyous way. So these kind of questions are good fodder for, well, where are we on this, and where may we agree or disagree? So let's jump into the first one. And boy, this is a big one, because let me read it, and I think you'll sense it as soon as I read it, how hot button this could be. Does a DCW allow for Reformed theology? Can the doctrine of original sin, for example, can the doctrine of original sin exist within a DCW? Does justification by faith alone, one of the solas of the Reformed tradition, hinge on the doctrine? Should substitutionary atonement be dropped in a DCW? And if so, what exactly is substituted for when Christ died on behalf of sinners? So the questioner goes on, but basically what he's asking is, so what do you think? Can my Reformed friend, or can I, with Reformed theology, add in a DCW and make it work like an engine running on, good fuel? Will the engine keep running if I drop in a gallon or two or fill it up with DCW gasoline? Here is my opinion. I may not make my Reformed friends happy with it, but let's give it a shot. And I say this with hopefully all the grace I have to my Reformed friends, because I was Reformed. I mean, again, I'm coming from a Reformed background. Most of us in an evangelical church, if you go to a standard evangelical church today, take it for granted, there's a Reformed tradition at play. Now, there might be, pieces of it that aren't played out as strongly. Let's say baptism, adult immersion baptism may be in your church. That doesn't mean it's not Reformed. That just means they have pulled out infant baptism and stuck in adult baptism. So, in other words, this is a good question, because we're getting into the issue of what constitutes a DCW. And when you have this huge ball rolling downhill called Reformed theology, now we have to confront it. So here's my answer. This is a challenging question, similar to, and here's what I'd say to that questioner. I would say, well, does a DCW allow for Roman Catholic theology? Because at issue, when you're asked that way, I hope you can feel this out, that any theological tradition, as it starts describing their story of the Bible, they will have words, phrases, interpretations, understandings that eventually come to the front of the conversation with a person with a DCW, and you say to yourselves, or you look at each other and say, well, that's not what I think it means, right? So could I add DCW to Roman Catholicism? I would say, yeah, but there's going to be things that pop up along the way where a DCW and a Catholic would say, I think we're talking two different systems. So now let's get to Reformed. Let's be really specific here. Here's my concern. At the heart of the matter, if you listen to someone who's Reformed, is the starting point of Lutheran or Reformed theology. What Luther did, and I appreciate it, he rightly challenged the doctrines of the medieval Roman Catholic Church of the 1500s. But when he did so as a priest who was not trying to leave the church. He wanted to keep the church going down a certain path, but change some, well, a lot, but change numerous doctrines within, and here's the problem, the same model of salvation. Reformed theology and Roman Catholicism have the same model for salvation. It's called sin management. Here we go again. We talked about this last time. So what they differ on is the means of sin management, but they agree that sin management's the problem. So there's where, and let me just end. Let me end with it this way, Mike, and then I'm glad to hear your thoughts. There are many ideas within a DCW which causes, I think, the Reformed theologian to say, well, that's not how the Westminster tradition would say it, right? There's numerous things that, as I read the Westminster tradition, whether the confessions or the Belgic confession, all the things that come from that, there's going to be different moments in the story where we look at each other and say, that's not really where I'm going, or that's not how I take that verse, because what you're referring to or reacting to as a reformer is the Catholic doctrine of something. To me, the DCW, at its most genius point, is saying, I don't need to start with the Roman Catholic Church. I get to go back to the original text and read it for itself. It's my source document. And I don't even think about the Roman Catholic tradition when I'm doing that. And I find that my Reformed friends are constantly referring back to Catholic doctrines and responding to Catholic doctrines, and that's fine. But the DCW is built on a completely different way of looking at the text. And that's where I'm nervous then. For a quick answer, does the DCW allow for Reformed theology? I think both systems run on different kinds of gasoline, and at some point the engine's going to sputter. What do you think?
I think I'm a little uncomfortable about making DCW itself its own theological tradition or theological mode, right? Because I think part of it, because even back to your previous slide, to that previous question, I could even just substitute Roman Catholicism and insert Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, Church of the East, Persian Church, Syria, it could be any type of particular theological framework. The way that I would frame DCW is not its separate, system framework by itself. It's simply just bringing in the cultural and background context of what we're all drawing from, which is originally from the actual biblical scriptures. The question is, how much do we allow the ancient context and, mindset of the audience and of the writers influence our interpretation of that same text, right? And I think Luther was doing the best that he could. Same thing with Calvin and Zwingli, where they took the material that they understood, the latest in research in the 16th, 17th century, and started going back to the scriptures of okay, now that we can actually see what the Greek actually says, this doesn't actually mean sacred. This is actually mystery. This doesn't actually mean and they started going back and forth, and just even doing that rocked the foundations of Western Christianity. I would just propose that all that we are simply doing with a Divine Council worldview, even with our podcast, is just simply asking, can we go back with more information now after all of these additional centuries and continue to refine and reform and even, maybe even update or maybe discard, as scary as that word may sound, certain ideas that were, for good intents and purposes, they were well intended, but they were probably not accurate. And so I think that's for a longer conversation, because I think any theological system would benefit from actually honestly looking at the scriptural texts with more of the historical cultural context. And that should and probably would affect how that propagates out to later doctrines and frameworks. But I think that takes some real honest looking back and seeing how would this all work out.
Let me throw this, though, at you. And it's because we've talked to Matthew Bates twice that I think we can use him as a test case. Fair enough? Yep. As a DCW podcast, we had Matthew Bates on because we appreciated his view expressed in several books, the latest being the Wars, the Salvation Wars book.
Beyond the Salvation Wars.
Beyond the Salvation Wars, where he said, and I, as a DCW person, was appreciative, because what I found him doing was going back to the original Second Temple era and asking, what is pistis? What does that root word mean in its original use, right?
Yeah.
And we were enamored by that. And we said, that's what a DCW mindset does. It goes back to the text, okay? Now, why did and I can bring it up because it's so public, okay? Why did the Southern Baptist Convention so roundly criticize that book? To me, it's because they said the Westminster divines are upset. You're not talking Westminster Catechism. You're using a word in a way that the Catechism doesn't. And there's my problem. In other words, the response was not, let's go back to the text in the Second Temple and see how pistis was used by Josephus. They never brought that up. They kept saying, but, and the problem they had was just the Westminster tradition was at stake. And that's where and I'll say this right to my Reformed friends, you've got to get rid or let go of that tradition long enough to just listen to the argument from someone who's arguing Second Temple. And I don't think Calvin and Luther really did that. And that, in other words, their source book was the Catholic Church, and they were arguing against the source book. The source book for Bates, for example, or for us, I think, is the New Testament documents or Old Testament documents. And I'm just sensing a different use of those texts. Are you?
I think there's I was about to use the word fear, but I think fear is a little too strong because that's assuming a lot of about their intentions. But I do think that, especially if you really are going into a very particular framework, it can be a little overwhelming to be given the prospect that you might have to revisit the actual ground foundation of your framework and ask honest questions. Is this accurate based now on the latest of information and research that we have of that time? Because if we are putting the scriptures ahead and saying that all of our thoughts, our theological musings, our philosophies, our theologies are all drawing from the same source. If we understand the context of the message of that source better, does that affect the base assumptions that are made from our theological framework? And if so, do we need to make adjustments? Do we start needing to do some renovations within that framework? And, like the article that I've been focused on writing for that book, that Fresh With for Mike, that was part of my proposal in that paper, that ultimately the value of what Mike's hermeneutic is that you don't necessarily have to toss out Reformed theology or Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy or whatever else, but really honestly go back and renovate, improve, make it a stronger argument, make it tighter, because we all benefit in the end from that. But we can't benefit if people are not willing to go back with honest eyes and just say, this needs to be fixed. This needs to be renovated. This is not as accurate as before. Just as much as I appreciate a good contractor who will go into the bones of my home and tell me honestly, there are termites here and the wall's about to collapse. We need to replace this because this is not a strong foundation anymore. And so that's what I would say. I wouldn't go as to say that they are incompatible or the running on different fuels. I think that metaphor is not as accurate. I think it's better to look at the DCW as a way of, this is a helpful tool in coming back to refining our comprehension of the scriptures and the mindset of the original authors and audience, because we're part of the same family, and we have now information that Martin Luther and Calvin did not have, and even their own disciples afterwards, they were basing a lot of their thoughts on just the musings of their forefathers, not necessarily back to the original text. And I think that is a little scary. If we keep on doing that, then we ironically lose the enthrallment that we're supposed to have with the original text and become more enthralled with what others have said about what others have said about the text.
Yeah. I am convinced that God does allow for individual human discovery. I've said that. And I think that what that means, in essence, get ready to be shocked every generation with something that the human race discovers. And we are all going to collectively say, why didn't we figure this out before? The answer is, we just never thought of it. In other words, we're always coming up with amazing things. And I'd say the same for Bible study. It's still a young profession or a young topic of study. I mean, Bible archaeology only started in the mid 1700s. The idea of unearthing a tell in the ancient world and digging through layers and trying to determine, the value of this pile of rubble for biblical research started a couple hundred years ago. That's it, which is just stunning to me that those piles of rubble sat there for millennia and no one had the desire, and maybe I'm overgeneralizing now, but the common sense to get a shovel and go looking for what's going on here. And I would say the same thing with Greek and Hebrew. We have the ability today far beyond what a Calvin and Luther could do in biblical study. And as long as we believe that, then now the door is open for and I'll buy your challenge to my analogy that maybe gasoline's the wrong term, but for my Reformed friends, I just have a lot of them. I mean, a lot of them. And I just keep finding our conversations drifting toward, but the Westminster Catechism doesn't say that. And I want to say, would you just drop it? Let that go for a second and think about the text and let's deal with the text. Hello, deal with the text. And I constantly find them saying, maybe your word fear then comes up, but if I do that, then this and that and this, and by the time I'm done, I'm not Westminster anymore. And that's where I am. So maybe I'm arguing from a little bit of frustration too, but I'm just stunned by that personal side of my conversations with my Reformed friends. It usually, lead balloon or screen door in a submarine feeling. It's just, this isn't going anywhere because we're not talking the same way about the text, it seems. So I guess we need to move on because otherwise I'm just going to grind.
Well, Ron, can I just say one more thing here?
Yeah.
I mean, because, now I'm a little worked up.
Okay.
But what I would challenge, and it's maybe because I don't have, I guess I don't have as many Reformed, like really deep down into the camp. But I am coming from a non-denominational background, honestly. I'm at a church where I pastor that is it is part of a denomination. It's actually a cousin denomination to the church that you go to generally. And like, I would say that on the greater scope of what is happening in the world, especially with the majority church. And when I say majority church, I'm talking about like the global church, like outside of the West, where you have essentially what is being termed as a fourth branch of the church growing, where you have folks outside of Western influence, but they're coming to worship and love our beautiful triune God. And yet they're asking questions of, well, we're not necessarily Reformed. We're not necessarily Roman Catholic. We're not necessarily Eastern Orthodox or any of these things. And yet they're trying to draw from the best of all these worlds, but also developing their own doctrine. And they also believe in the supernatural. And so when they encounter divine counsel worldview materials, they're able to glom onto it so much more easily.
All right. Let me jump off that jumping board and is that a good analogy? And say, there's my point, Mike. How come my Reformed friends are so slow on the uptake of a DCW? Divine beings are real. And I say, my Reformed friends go, nah, I don't know if that makes a difference for me. It's like, you're kidding me. In other words, you're so sold on a system that you show them a huge tipping point, it seems to me, that if I make those beings real, that changes a lot. And to my Reform side of my friendships, it's like, maybe so, maybe not. And that's where I'm coming from. That they don't, like you just said, there's this fourth wave, as it were, that looks at the DCW and says, yes, that makes sense to me. And that's what I'm not feeling with my Reform friends. They're not excited about it at all. Anyway, enough on that. We can, we'll revisit that. I'm sure
we probably will revisit that many times.
Yes. All right. How about this one? This is a good one. What did salvation mean originally? That word salvation, just the word. Let's talk about that. What did salvation mean to the ancient reader, especially Old Testament? From what or whom or where were they being saved? The same question then you could move into early Christianity, Jews and Gentiles. What did they think salvation meant? And I'm just going to give my answer on that word. This could get into a lot of other side issues, but I think I can answer it simply on my side, or give you my simple answer, Mike, and stick with that word save, and then let it go at that. Or if we want to branch off a little bit, that'd be fine. But I think the specific question has a specific answer, and here it is. Salvation nearly always referred to in the Old Testament to physical protection, even that of death, to be saved from death. So nobody in the Old Testament is being saved from hell. That's never, even from Sheol. They're not asking to be saved from Sheol. They're asking to not die and thus go to Sheol. So, everyone goes to Sheol in the Old Testament, so no one's being asked to be saved from Sheol. Later now, here's just a trajectory of understanding as I see the word salvation throughout the biblical story. The hope came of a righteous person being saved, and they will use that idea, from the day of the Lord judgment that starts in Isaiah 2 and on. It's a later Old Testament theme that the day of Yahweh, the day of the Lord, is going to come, and guess what? It's going to reward the earth, or, recompense the earth for its lack of worship of Yahweh. And so in that sense, there's the salvation from that day, okay, in the strictest sense. Now, in the New Testament, let's jump up there. Here's where we grab verses out of like Romans 10:9 or Ephesians 2:8. You will be, or you have been saved, and we use that word. We pick it up and put it in our Awana memory verse list. And we move this future, but in that sense, here's where, again, I would say a DCW is going to be happy to think contextually that even there in Romans 10, Ephesians 2, we're talking saved from the day of Christ, Philippians 1:10. And the day of Christ is the elongation of the idea of the day of the Lord. Now it's the day of Christ. He's the one who is going to come back and recompense the earth for its lack of loyalty to Yahweh. So even there, I don't sense that salvation from hell is the original use of the term. Okay, it will be, for the best I can sense, the later 18th, 19th century evangelical revivals of Wesley, even Billy Graham, where now we talk about being saved from the punishment of hell. But I don't see any biblical material on that way of saying it. That seems to be a later rendition of being saved that works in a mass evangelism campaign. But to recap, salvation is physical death. They want to be saved from a physical problem. Then it's used of saved from the day of the Lord. And then the New Testament's being saved from the day of Christ. So, yes, it's going to be saved from God's wrath. I guess you could say it that way. But they were thinking very temporally, even all the way to the end of the New Testament, being saved from the day of God's wrath. So,
yeah, I mean, I think if a person were to just use a good lexicon, for example, they would see that the primary definitions for both the Hebrew and the Greek usages of the word, normally translated as salvation or deliverance, tended to gravitate towards physical safety. deliverance, being preserved from physical or, from extreme harm. And so I think that's something to kind of consider. Eventually, as the language slowly is evolving through, especially religious texts within the church, it slowly would go into more of the metaphysical. But it always originally started from more of like, I'm thinking about a very eminent physicality accommodation idea to at least, communicate to the listener. Well, why does this matter? Why do I want to be delivered from, the day of the Lord? Well, if you're not allegiant to the right God, well, guess what side you're going to be on
Right.
on the day of
You'll
the
need
Lord.
to be saved. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think there's a little bit of that. This does remind me of an interesting conversation that Tim and John from the Bible Project, they had a conversation with Scott McKnight. And it was one of his books. It was where he dove into the topic about atonement. And they asked him towards the end of that podcast episode, why is it that this particular model of atonement, the penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA, became so popular amongst evangelicals? And I remember McKnight's answer was simply, if you look at how the Big Tent revivals were done, especially in the 19th century, many evangelists gravitated towards that particular atonement model as a quick and easy way of explaining the gospel. Mm-hmm. And then just over time, that just became part of the accepted theology, the most popular assumption of what atonement meant and about what did it mean to be saved, because it's coming from a lot of the Big Tent revival language that was used in the US. So it was fascinating just to kind of realize, wow, like a lot of the American evangelical way of talking about salvation, we unknowingly are still using sort of the mental whirl of the 19th century revivalists, 19th century evangelists.
Yep. And not that God can't use various means to bring people into the kingdom. I'm sure he does many, many different ways, and some including, like when I was 5, I prayed the sinner's prayer, and I became a believer in that sense, officially, I believe. And yet I'm sure the Lord would tell me, well, you became a Christian in ways that you can't even unpack in your own memory. But anyway, very good. Let's go on to another one. This is a good one, or a good, interesting question. And maybe it just is going to be a clarification when I answer it. Here's the question, if the law of Moses was given as a concession for Israel to realign pagan practices toward Yahweh, which is what I had been reported to have said, right? If the law of Moses was given as a concession for Israel to realign pagan practices toward Yahweh, why does David emphasize the law so commonly in the Psalms, like Psalm 19, Psalm 119? We would expect him to downplay the law of Moses if this were true. If what you're saying is true, you'd expect David to be less proud of and excited about the law. My answer is to recast what I said, and maybe I made a mistake in how I said it originally, but here's what I meant to say, and maybe if I would go back, I think I said this, but let me just say it again. To rephrase my concern or my point, it's the sacrificial system, as opposed to the entire Old Testament law, that was originally given to the Israelites as a way of concession. What I mean by that is, and I'm quoting Maimonides, the 11th century Spanish rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, who said, in a long quote that I had given back in a previous episode, that we as Jews were allowed to continue the practice of sacrifice in Canaan as learned in Egypt, as long as we did it to the right address. That's how he put it. And so what Maimonides is simply thinking through is the logic of, why are we sacrificing here in Canaan when when all the other nations are doing it too, is kind of a thing. So said that way, then I think David's on my side, because when you get to Psalm 19 or 119, he never mentions ritual sacrifice. That's not what he loves about the law. In fact, when he does get to ritual sacrifice in any context in the Psalms, he downplays it. especially Psalms 40 and 51. He basically says God doesn't need it at all. And that's an amazing statement for him to say in the middle of the period of law, Psalm 51, sacrifice you do not desire, is a way of, again, a lot of traditional preaching that I've heard, they rephrase that to mean he doesn't really desire it as much as, a good heart. Well, no, the text says you do not desire it. That's not where your mind is, not where your heart is. And I'd say that's answering the question then for me, that he did not, he gave sacrifice to the people as a concession. One more thing, and I'll let you jump in. Think of this, and to me, history is so important on this. Atoning sacrifice did not enter the story of the Bible until Mosaic Law period, Exodus 20 and on. That's about 1440 BC. It ended abruptly in 586 BC. That means you got about a 900-year period there where you get sacrificial laws and tabernacle traditions and, the whole system, as it were. Only 900 years. So what happens before and after that period has got to be taken into account when describing its importance to God. And there's so much, emphasis in our theology books given on the law, and especially the sacrifices within the law. And then those same books don't emphasize or take into account, it seems to me, the vast number of years before that time and the vast number of years after that time, where God is still working with people and calling them righteous. Here's Abraham, Romans 4, he was righteous because of his faith, not the law. In other words, the whole history of the story, to me, also reeks of, why did we have this little 900-year period of sacrifice? Is it because God really wanted it, and couldn't wait for people to sacrifice? I would say just the opposite. He didn't need it, then he allowed it, then he again didn't need it, and that's where we sit in this the historical story of sacrifice is limited. It's on the ground in Canaan. It's, again, for a very specific purpose, for a very specific time. And that's the question. It's not, does God not want the law? It's, did God want sacrifice? So what do you think?
I guess I'll pose my answer in first, we have to clarify, what do we mean by the law? Because I've said this before in our podcast. I've said this to a bunch of friends, even at my church now these days, that a lot of times within evangelicalism, and especially those of us who've grown up in some sort of Protestant background, I think we are carrying on a lot of the emotional baggage from Luther. Right? Because the way that he looked at Old Testament, especially, was he was almost viewing it with the same disdain that he had towards Roman Catholic canon law. And I think there's a little bit of that sometimes seep into our wondering about what was the purpose of the law of Moses. And then we conflate the law of Moses as though it's a whole entire uniform, came from Sinai in one giant moment law, and that it's even a legalistic judicial law. And yet the reality is, when we read the narrative of what's going on in the first 5 books, the law is coming out slowly, bit by bit. And it's not even law, it's instruction. Mm-hmm. It's, hey, this woman is being accused by her husband that she had adultery, but there's no proof. What do we do? And then God gives a case of, this is what you would do. This is what you have to do. And in that particular moment in Numbers 5, it's not any man that will judge her. It's not the priest that will judge her. It's not the husband that will judge her. Ultimately, she will drink a muddy concoction before the Lord. Mm-hmm. And he is the one that ultimately will judge whether she actually had adultery or not. And even if she is found guilty, the punishment was so different compared to all their neighboring Canaanite culture, neighbors, where the woman would not even die. She just would be rendered infertile, but she wouldn't be dead, versus the way that all these other kind of cultures would have this kind of trial by fire incident. She would be gone. She would be dead. And so I think there's something that has to be said about how, like, the law, is it a concession? Sure. It's a concession in the sense of, with what you understand about the world right now, I am speaking into that moment of what you have seen your neighbors, of what you have experienced in Egypt, what you're seeing with the people that you're encountering. How am I different compared to those gods?
Well, and to me, that's Psalm 119. David relishes learning about Yahweh as a God that's different from the nation's gods.
And even the whole entire sacrifice, the whole entire reason why even the tabernacle and the whole entire ritual of the high priest, the sacrifices that need to be done, a lot of that was also in response to a major incident, the golden calf. Like there was that moment of how there seemed to have been a moment before Moses went up Sinai where it really seemed like God's spirit was going to come down and basically dwell amongst the people. And they did not want to. They were too afraid. And like, I think that we got a glimpse of what God actually wanted, which was to be amongst his people. But because of the people's own fear, all right, let's tone it down. Let's work with something else. Let's work with something that you might recognize and you might understand. And I don't know. I think part of the question, even the quote that you mentioned, Ron, it goes into that whole period, especially after the Babylonian destruction of the temple, that it really brought into question, what do we do now? Right? Because we don't have a temple anymore. We can't make sacrifices anymore. Are we no longer the people of God? And
God said, sure you are. You don't need that thing.
Yeah. And I think that's the beauty
Solomon
of just like the fact
about.
that they struggled with that question.
I know. And to me, it's very instructive what God does when he lets that temple get destroyed. Jeremiah 7, is it the temple, it can't go down. And you hear Yahweh in the background saying, oh, it can. We're going to be just fine without having that system of worship that you're so used to.
Well, and what was interesting was that even a few days ago, I'm reading, for the work I do at Awakening, I was reading this write-up, and this person is talking about the book of Esther and essentially degrading Esther and Mordecai because they're examples of being bad Jews.
Okay.
And
they didn't return, you mean?
Yeah, that they didn't return. And the writer of this particular commentary was coming from this perspective that every Jewish person was supposed to go back to Israel because that's their ancestral homeland. Why did they stay in Persia? Why did they stay in Babylon? Like, it's totally wicked that they did that. And it's kind of weird and ironic, right? Because this is a commentary on the book of Esther, which is a record of God using normal human beings in the right place at the right time.
Right.
To prevent the genocide of the entire Jewish race. And yet the commenter was taking the time of basically bashing Mordecai and Esther because they were not being good, faithful, Torah-abiding Jews. And part of me was just like, this is part of the question of that time. This
is where DCW solves it for me. It says, look at the text, look at the context, look at the time period, think like them, and how they would have, in other words, it's fine. Jeremiah said, go to Babylon and make homes, plant gardens, redeem the city, get involved in local government. That's all they were doing. And so a DCW comes to the aid of that issue to me.
Yeah.
So very good. Thank you. Let's hit another one. Are there different kinds of sin in the New Testament? This is just an interesting comment, and let me give a quick answer to it. There are a few options for New Testament writers when they speak of sin in Greek. Is this important when we interpret such passages as John 1:29 and 8:11, which uses hamartia, the very common word that is often translated from the Septuagint word for kata into Greek? It goes hamartia. And Romans 4:15, which is an example of using another word called parabasis. Parabasis and hamartia are the generally the two words translated as sin, and the questioner is asking if there's a difference in meaning. My quick answer is just to look at how it's used and looking at lexicons. In Greek, hamartia means sin, or translated as sin in a general sense, missing the mark, falling short of a standard. It's not, again, a religious word. And it applies to both Jews and Gentiles in the story of the Bible, whether intentional or not. It's a very, very general term. It's, again, kata in Hebrew is translated into hamartia in Greek. Parabasis, though, on the other hand, it's an interesting word study, commonly is translated as transgression, and refers usually, this is again a generalization, to knowingly breaking a law or a command. It tends to be the more serious of the two words, willful disobedience by someone who knows what God wanted. And so it can be applied to both Jews and Gentiles. I do notice, this is a study that can be done on, as someone has time, when a Jew talks about Gentile sin, they often will use the word parabasis. Because think, again, culturally, when you'd look across at a group of Gentiles, you would see idolatry, uncleanness, fists basically pointing up to Yahweh, and you would use the word parabasis in that sense. But again, I wouldn't make it a hard and fast rule, but there are some interesting uses of parabasis in Galatians, for example, and it seems to be the Jewish understanding of how a Gentile thinks and acts. So that's my quick answer. Anything you want to add?
I think there are. Well, I'm curious. What do you think about these two other words? I'm just looking through my logos just to see how the Greek translated certain other words like iniquity, and the word for iniquity does show up 4 times, but it's two different words.
Okay.
One, it 3 times it appears in Acts 8:23, for example, where it says, "For I see that you are a gall of bitterness and in the bond of iniquity." 2 Timothy 2:19, where Paul says to Timothy, "But God's foundation stands bearing this seal. The Lord knows those who are his, and let everyone who names the name of the Lord depart from iniquity."
What's
and
the
then
Greek
Hebrews
word behind
8:12,
that?
"For I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more." It's a different Greek word. I'm trying to see if I can actually... Azakia. So that's the Greek word equivalent for iniquity.
Unrighteousness. Maybe it's just taking dikaios and putting a negative in front of it.
Probably.
Unrighteousness. Could be something like that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then there's one other one that appears in Revelation 18:5, adakema, where it says 18:5, "For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities."
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting. There's not a lot of many words for sin.
This can be a study a person can do just using logos, then based on the ability to double click and you get your words. So
yeah,
that's my quick understanding, but I'm certainly willing to hear more. So let's do another. This is interesting. Some take Deuteronomy 30 verses 15 to 18 to mean that following Torah is necessary for salvation. Yet you, and I think he's speaking to me, yet you say the opposite of obeying Torah is the worship of other gods. Okay? So clarify this, as it seems that obedience and not worship is at stake. Now, again, here's where Reformed theology does say this, that, when you're reading Deuteronomy 30, it's expecting perfect obedience. In the curse of the law, I've heard this all my life, the curse of the law is that you don't fully follow the law, and you would thus be cursed, Deuteronomy 30. I think that's a huge misreading of the Old Testament. The curse of the law is never in the Old Testament. It occurs once in the New Testament, Galatians 3. And there it's referring to a Gentile audience who's realizing the curse of the law is that you can't stay Gentile and be righteous. That's the curse of the law, clearly, in Galatians 3. But reformers, because, again, I don't think they're thinking culturally, they go back and they read Deuteronomy 30 and they say, well, it looks like you got to be obedient. And that's the rule. Here's my response, and I'm going to be a little jaded, if I may, in my response and say, just read the text. And I'm just going to put it on screen if you want to read it on screen. Note how Deuteronomy 30, 17 and 18 ends. But, so Deuteronomy 30, 11 and up to 16 is saying, follow the law, obey me, obey my commandments, obey my rules, my Torah, whatever. It just keeps going at you. And then it finally says, here's the alternative. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to, and guess where it goes, worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. So I would argue that the questioner, by telling me, looking at Deuteronomy 30, 17 and 18, that's the whole point. Look at the text and it says, yes, follow me, obey me, but here's the alternative. You'd expect, if you're a reformer, for it to say, if you fail even on one thing, you're going down. No, it doesn't say that. It says go after other gods. So I would recommend that right in the text, and you can do this beyond Deuteronomy 30. I might have said this in one of our earlier podcasts, that I used to play this game with my college students when I was teaching Bible. I would say, other gods, where are they in the Bible? Try this. Close your eyes, open your Bible, put your finger anywhere you want. I bet you within 1 circumference inch of your finger, you're going to see a reference to another deity. It's not hard to do. In other words, if you know what you're looking for, you can find them everywhere. And I would say that this is the same thing when it comes to what's at stake in Torah. Is it obedience or is it worship? And here's where, again, a reformer, to me, they can't see the tree. Nope, they can't see the forest because of the tree. They're stuck on this Westminster idea that God demands perfection. And the Bible never claims that, but they start their theology with that as the starting point. And that's why they're so nervous about, I think, other gods getting involved. It messes with the story. And I'm being hard on my Reformed friends again, but this is where I've often heard them say, you got to be perfect. The Old Testament demands perfection. And of course I say, show me one place where that's ever said. No. What's demanded is loyalty to Yahweh. And what's presumed in that loyalty is obedience. Fair enough. When I get married to my wife, she demands loyalty and she presumes obedience. Take out the trash. But the standard is loyalty. The result is obedience. And that's all I want to say about this. But again, I think the question's good, but I think the very text that I was asked to read has right in there that what's at stake in Torah is worship, not obedience.
Well, if I'm correct, if I remember this properly, because the question included verse 15 to 18. And so even verse 15 and 16, you already get the context of what Moses is saying here. In verse 16, it says, for I command you today. It doesn't start with, I command you today to obey the Lord your God. He starts off with, I command you today to love Yahweh your God.
Yeah.
And if you love
Yahweh,
him,
it makes a big difference. Yeah.
Then walk in obedience to him, which is really not that much different from what you just said, Ron, of if I love my wife, I will go and take out the trash. It's like they're like, you are not taking out the trash in order to earn her love. You are taking out the trash because you already love her. Right? It like there are things that are in the proper order here. And so already, even, if some folks want to even argue about whether love and loyalty are the same thing, I would say they're enmeshed with another.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like, I mean, try this if you're actually married and say to your significant other, I love you, but I'm not going to be loyal to you. Right. And see how that goes.
Right.
Right. It doesn't make any sense. And so to make that argument that this is all about obedience and trying to earn the love, but that doesn't even make sense in the narrative of the first 5 books of Moses that we got. Because by the time we get to the moment of Sinai, before the covenant is even presented, God's declaration to Israel was, you are my segula, my treasured possession. In other words, like, there is this built-in love and affection towards the people. And thus, will you now return that same sense of love and loyalty back to me? And I like that's the very get-go from their relationship in the very beginning as a nation. Was even before the law was presented. They were a treasured possession and they had done nothing to earn that.
Yeah. Are we talking, here's my question then, Mike, are we talking in this last 5 minutes, are we talking DCW, or is this just a part of DCW? To me, this is at the heart of DCW, that we're talking loyalty to a deity. That's the story of Scripture. That's the heart of DCW theology. That's why I'm saying that I have trouble with my Reformed friends, because they don't see that. They see obedience. Perfect obedience is the standard. And I'm saying that right off the bat, if that's your standard, you're not going to ever come across a DCW mindset, because you can't switch your story out.
I guess in my mind, a part of me is confused, because it almost feels like this is a Venn diagram. We overlap here, right? This is it's like we're trying to say to worship the Lord our God and to love the Lord our God. We all should be acknowledging that the love and loyalty it takes primacy. I don't quite understand how can this be.
Well, but read the Westminster Confession. What takes you to hell? Original guilt, Genesis 3. It starts with a different story, Mike. It's a completely different story. And now you've got to have something to solve the original guilt, and you get that thing going. I'm just saying that, back to our first question, can you mix Reformed and DCW? On this very question, is worship at stake in Torah, or is obedience at stake? The Reformer has to say obedience, because he needs perfection behaviorally to get Jesus to be, remember how it goes? Jesus is behaviorally perfect. His behavioral perfection is applied to me, and that whole system is built on the need for behavioral perfection. And I'm saying, throw that whole thing out, start over, and watch for worship being the issue. And the Bible will purr fine. The engine purrs beautifully. And even when you come to Deuteronomy 30, no problem. Even though someone might say, it looks like obedience is important. I'd say, I know. After I'm done podcasting tonight, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to go obey my wife. I'm going to say, we missed supper here. Is there anything I can do? And washing the dishes will probably be how I end my night. And that's good, because I'm a teammate with her, right? And so I'm just saying that love, and as you just said, love and loyalty work together, and you can't even tell the difference sometimes. Yeah. And obedience, you can't even tell that difference sometimes. And that's all I'm saying, is that the system, the story that we're telling in a DCW is extremely worship driven. And I'm not seeing that in my Reformed friends. So I don't want to complain again. I'm just saying that we're kind of back to that first question.
Yeah.
All right. Last question. I saw a video clip of Dr. Heiser recommending that in proclaiming the name of Yahweh to Moses in Exodus 34:5, Yahweh was speaking of a third person being described. What is your view? Can you recommend further sources? The sources, I'll have to let you help me on that. I didn't study that end of it. What kind of sources can you find that recommend this word of God, memra idea, being a person or a figure standing in the room? Here's my quick answer. While there may be indications of Yahweh's word, quote unquote, taking on human form, and one of Mike's favorites is 1 Samuel 3, right, where the word of the Lord came to Samuel and stood at the head of the bed, or the foot of the bed, and Samuel saw something talking to him. So it sounds like word there could be actual taking on human form. My opinion is just that its general meaning is to preferred in most cases, where davar, the Hebrew word for a word, it just means matter, word, thing, affair. It's an extremely general word. And so in most stories where it occurs, you're going to have the word of Jeremiah, the word of, like in 1 Samuel 4, right around the corner from 1 Samuel 3, you have 1 Samuel 4 where the word of Samuel goes out to Israel. And there you would understand that, I'm sure everyone would, as not a person, but as a thing, a matter. The matter of Samuel went out to the rest of the world. So my guess is that there are maybe places where you could say word is was a figure that stood there many times. And for my theology, I don't require it. I see it as a general thing that anyone can have. My word can stand, as it were, as well.
If I remember correctly, Dr. Heiser did talk about this a bit, especially when he did a course in Logos where he went into the two Yahwehs, or essentially the two powers doctrine. And so he went into, it's not found in the original in Hebrew, because yes, it's the word dabar. But eventually once they started moving into speaking Aramaic, and the rabbis, the teachers, are reading the Hebrew scriptures and they're translating, paraphrasing into Aramaic, that's where Memra begins, appearing. And part of their kind of musings over time was that the word came is so associated with Memra, the Lord, and that it's almost as though they are one and the same. And even in the Aramaic translation of Genesis 1, it actually associates the Memra of the Lord being the one to create, to actually call out, let there be light. And so there's a book that came out a few years ago. We actually did talk about this during the Two Powers episode that we had. One of the authors is Adam Wynn.
I remember that book. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact title, but it is a recent work that dove into the two powers, into the two Yahwehs idea. And they explored particularly the Memra, a progression of how that theological thought went, and why would it be considered a manifestation or essentially a second Yahweh figure because of that. And a lot of that, they associated the connection of Yahweh to creator. And so can this figure that appears in the scriptures, does it appear to show attributes where it's connected to creation, to the act of creation, to the time of creation? Can we make that case? And that's part of what they were doing in that book. It was a fascinating kind of journey. The irony was, I realized, was that Mike had recorded an episode, a short course in Awakening that talked about the two Yahwehs. And he did this before this book came out. I don't even think he knew about this book, but he was going down the same trajectory about creator and Yahweh. And thus, why is Memra, or why is the angel of the Lord, or why is wisdom? And so he was actually making the similar connections, but it's just hilarious to me. It was like, you didn't even know that these guys were doing this research.
Yeah, well, they were probably using the same source material.
Yeah. So anyways, there's a lot to be dug into. And I'm looking forward to the fact that these guys, Adam Wynn being one of the writers, they're going to be doing 2 more books that go a little bit more into Second Temple material with the two Yahweh doctrine. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what they have in the second and third books coming up.
Well, very good. We are done. And thanks again, everyone, for your questions. Keep them coming if you can. Again, questions.dcwp@gmail.com is where to send them, and Mike will gather them as they come in, and we'll have another session of Q&A as we go forward in a few weeks, or whenever we think there's a critical mass of good questions that we need to get to. So send in your best questions you can, and it'll cause us to want to have another Q&A because I enjoy it. So we'll be getting, as we continue in our next podcast, we'll be getting back into John and the Gospel of John, and continuing our word-by-word study of that book from a DCW lens, which is fascinating for me, and I hope for you as well. So thank you, Mike, for your part in this again, and for everyone listening. Until we talk again, may the Lord bless you, keep you, and love each other well.